You know, in our everyday lives, trust is just a feeling. It's something we have for our friends and family. But in the world of law, oh, it's something totally different. It's a force that can be measured, and when it's broken, it has some really serious consequences. So today, we're going to explore what happens when the law decides that trust has been abused and how it steps in to protect us when we are at our most vulnerable.
Just think about it for a second. Who do you turn to for the big stuff? It might be your doctor, your lawyer, maybe a financial advisor, or even just a really close family friend. We put our faith in these people, right? We believe they've got our back, especially when we're facing tough choices.
But what if a decision you made with their guidance just feels off? Maybe you sold a valuable asset for way less than it was worth, or you suddenly changed your will to benefit them in a huge way. That's the exact moment the law gets interested and decides to take a much closer look.
Now, to really unpack these situations, the legal system has a specific idea it works with. It's not just looking for a simple broken promise. It's trying to identify something called a relationship of influence. So let's dig into what that actually means. The absolute key word here is potential. See, the law isn't trying to make influence illegal. That's just a normal part of life. What it does recognize is that some relationships have such a lopsided power dynamic that they need to be watched very, very carefully. And this is where things get really smart. The law doesn't just have one rigid rule for every situation. Instead, it's got two different routes, two separate paths that can take to figure out if trust was actually abused. Think of it like a legal roadmap.
Okay, so on one side, you've got path one. Here, influence is basically just assumed to exist simply because of the kind of relationship we're talking about. And, on the other side, there's path two, where you have to prove, from the ground up, that a special relationship of influence existed based on the specific facts. Two totally different starting lines, but both are racing toward the same finish line, making sure things are fair.
So let's start with path one. You can think of this one as the law's express lane. It's reserved for what are legally known as special relationships, where that potential for powerful influence is considered a given.
And these are the ones you'd probably guess. We're talking doctor and patient, lawyer and client, a trustee and the person they're managing assets for, or a religious advisor and a member of their congregation. In all of these dynamics, the law just says, yep, there's an inherent imbalance of power and knowledge here.
And this is huge. The whole idea of the burden of proof, who has to do the convincing in court, it completely flips. Normally, if you accuse someone, you have to prove it. But in these special relationships, if a deal looks suspicious, like in a classic old case where an advisor bought property from his student for way too cheap, it's the influential person who has to prove they acted fairly. They have to show that the other person made the decision with their eyes wide open.
Okay, but what about all the relationships that don't fit into those neat little boxes? Well, that's where path two comes in. This is more like the scenic route, where you first have to prove that a special level of trust even existed. This path is for everyone else. It could be a caregiver and an elderly person, a savvy manager and a young artist, or even just a helpful neighbor and a recent widow. It doesn't matter what you call the relationship. What matters is the reality that one person has, over time, come to completely depend on the other.
So how does a court figure this out? Well, first, the person who feels wronged has to prove that this deep, trusting relationship was real. Step two, they have to point to a transaction that just doesn't make sense on its own, one that really needs an explanation. And only after those two things are on the table does the burden of proof shift, and the other person has to justify what happened.
A perfect example of this is the case Johnson versus Buttress. It involved an elderly, illiterate man who gave away his only property to a relative he had come to lean on for everything. This case is a masterclass in how the court works. It shows they're not interested in labels. They want the real-world facts about dependency and how it can be taken advantage of.
All right, so we've got these two paths, right? One is based on a legal presumption, the other is all about the proof. Let's pull back for a second and look at the big picture of what the law is really trying to do here.
So, looking at them side by side, it's pretty clear. Path one, from cases like Tate v. Williamson, is all about the type of relationship, and that burden of proof shifts automatically. Path two, like we saw in Johnson v. Buttress, is all about the specific facts, and the burden only shifts after you've proven the trust. But check it out. The end goal is exactly the same, getting to the truth of what really happened. And that, right there, is the main takeaway. This two-path system is what makes the law so powerful. It's incredibly flexible, it has a shortcut for the obvious cases of power imbalance, but it also has a detailed, careful method for finding abuse in any kind of trusting relationship. No matter which path is taken, the goal is always the same: protecting vulnerable people from being exploited.
But this all leaves us with a really fascinating question for the future. We are creating new kinds of trust relationships all the time. Think about an AI that manages your entire retirement fund, or a social media influencer whose financial advice you follow down to the letter. Should relationships like that automatically be considered special relationships under Path 1? Or should we always have to prove the influence case by case under Path 2? It's a huge question the law is going to have to tackle very soon. Thanks for joining us for this explainer.